Let's dig into defunding the police a little bit more, shall we? Because the left has had to adjust the talking points a bit on this one. Perhaps first and foremost because it's crazy, but also Joe Biden is out there saying that he does not. This is the Democrats' great hope for fixing this country and fixing the future, and he's going to make everything better. Joe Biden saying, no, I'm not on board. I'm not on board for this.
Some demonstrators added equals defund the police. Do you support defunding the police?
No, I don't support defunding the police. I support conditioning federal aid to police based on whether or not they meet certain basic standards of decency and honorableness and, in fact, are able to demonstrate they can protect the community and everybody in the community.
Basic standards of decency and honorableness. So I want to be very clear here. Here's the Democrat nominee for the presidency, this confused buffoon that is being propped up by the Democrat left just so he can be the puppet that they will be able to pull the strings on once he does in fact become if he does in fact become the president of the United States. And he's saying that he's going to withdraw federal funds unless they meet standards of decency. So are cops not meeting standards of decency right now nationwide? Is that really, is it a systemic problem? Right? Is it a systemic issue? I would want to know. I'm really curious how they could prove that is the case. And they should have to prove it's the case if they're going to now make proclamations like this. So they're not meeting standards of decency in law enforcement across the country, local police, state police. That's quite an allegation. That's quite a charge. This is all just giving a slightly less aggressive version of what we're hearing from the left. But Biden knows that he's going to have to look some normal people in the eye who see the world as it is, of all races, creeds, and colors. He's going to look black, white, Asian Americans, Latino Americans to try to vote for him this fall. And he's going to look all those people in the eye, including a whole lot of people from all those different backgrounds who just want safety on the streets, who like their cops, who know they do a good job. And he's going to have to tell them, I'll be fair. I'll be fair to the police. Remember, we had Barack Obama as president for 8 years. And we had the Cambridge police acted stupidly. Remember that? Really? And then there was the beer summit because Barack Obama, he opened his mouth on that issue without really understanding the full facts of the situation. Right? I mean, the cops who showed up there, they weren't the bad guys. Someone called the cops and said they think that someone's trying to break into a house. They show up, they say, hey, what's going on? And the guy becomes indignant, and he's a Harvard professor. Okay, well, it's not the cops' fault. Right? I mean, anyway. But Barack Obama clearly, in order to placate the left-wing base, was always taking an initial position of the cops are a problem. Our cops are a problem in this country. Systemic racism through law enforcement is a problem. Therefore, cops are the instruments of that systemic racism. And notice it didn't. Did it get markedly better after having Obama as the commander-in-chief for 8 years and having Attorney General Eric Holder on the Justice Department and then Loretta Lynch? Did law enforcement really improve? No, there were riots in Ferguson and in Baltimore and other places across the country. There were these cases that would come up that the whole nation would have to focus on one incident with one cop in one place in one time killing somebody. And that was the dominant news story, and CNN would do all of the constant projection of the politics of grievance and trying to divide us more and more by race. Okay, well, let's now have a conversation about what's really supposed to happen and what they really think of law enforcement. Let's have a conversation about what's supposed, and I mean a conversation, not sit and take a lecture from the other side, which is what you tend to have happen in these circumstances. So then that brings me to how do cops feel right now? If you're a law enforcement officer and you see what's going on across the country, you see how all these cowardly journalists, one after another, just fall in line with the dominant narrative, which is that of the 7 or 800,000 sworn law enforcement officers across the country, cops of one kind or another, that of that number, there are so many who are racists. Even if they don't know they're racist, there are so many that we have to do a dramatic overhaul of the criminal justice system and of policing. That's calling out our cops who are doing a tough job and doing it very well day in and day out. But some officers have decided they've had enough of this. They think that it's gone too far. The New York Police Department's union president has decided to speak out about this. And this went a bit viral yesterday. People really felt like he's speaking for a lot of cops. Again, New York has a very diverse police department. I mean, there's a lot of ethnic diversity among New York cops. So you'd think the left would hold up the NYPD as, okay, they're doing a lot of these diversity and inclusion things that the left is always saying we need to have, and that they reflect the communities that they're policing and all this other stuff. And here's how some of the cops, I haven't talked to a cop who doesn't feel this way in New York, but here's at least how one cop, speaking for many of them, feels right now. Mark, play clip 4.
Everybody's trying to shame us into being embarrassed about our profession. Well, you know what? This isn't stained by someone in Minneapolis. It's still got a shine on it. And so do theirs. So do theirs. Stop treating us like animals and thugs, and start treating us with some respect. We don't condone Minneapolis. We roundly reject what he did as disgusting. It's disgusting. It's not what we do. It's not what police officers do. Our legislators abandoned us. The press is vilifying us. Well, you know what, guys? I'm proud to be a cop, and I'm going to continue to be proud to be a cop until the day I retire.
Some people, I think, finally feel like they're able to at least say that much, that we are proud of our cops. You know, think about this in other contexts. United States military. It's very difficult to make the case that you're a patriot and that you really care about your fellow Americans if you don't support our military, our armed services. You don't support the people. And I'm not saying that means you agree with every decision. I mean, I disagree with some of the decisions the military hierarchy has made. But if you don't really have admiration and respect for our troops, people rightly would ask, well, are you really a patriot? These people are the reason that we can even have a country and live in this incredibly free and prosperous country, those who serve in uniform. And so let's remember that there are, within the United States military, there are people who sometimes cross the line. There are people who kill civilians. There are people who act in a really unethical manner. And they are subject to UCMJ, and they are punished. And people don't then say, well, you know, our troops are systemically evil, because that would be insane, right? It's very, very rare. Given what our soldiers have been asked to do in war zones, given what our airmen and all of our armed services warriors all across the board of the military, given what they have been asked to do, they have an incredible record of both success on the battlefield, but also being moral in the conduct of war and reflecting the best of this country. That's not the same thing as saying that everything they do, everything that everyone does is great and fine. And there's, of course not. That's why there is UCMJ. That's why there are court martials. And people go to Leavenworth for years, for decades, if need be, if their conduct deserves it. But you wouldn't get away with saying, at least I don't, not yet. Well, because, you know, you wouldn't point to one incident and say, well, because this happened in this one place involving one soldier or a few soldiers, we got to rethink. I mean, the whole military is just full of people. No, of course not. Well, how is that really different from what we see here with our cops who are overwhelmed? I mean, not 9 unarmed African Americans were killed by police in the entire United States in 2019. I mean, if that's not a small number to describe tens of millions, or when you're talking about tens of millions of arrests that happen every year, what is a small? Are we waiting until the number is 0? Which means of the almost 1 million cops in the country, not one of them can cross the line, make a mistake, be a bad guy, without all cops being called bad guys? This is what they're doing. I mean, this is the way the conversation is unfolding right now. I mean, you have George Floyd's brother, Terrence Floyd, who now, look, he just lost his brother. He's grieving. I understand. But he is also entering into the national public conversation here to push for police reform. And here's what he had to say. Play clip 5.
I really love y'all for giving my brother this much support. Y'all could have been anywhere in the world, but y'all here with us right now. And this is a blessing. And this is bigger than George right now. We finna stop everybody from being afraid of the police. We have good police, but we have bad police. You can't sort them out, so we got to figure it out right now.
We have good police. We have bad police. You can't sort them out. No, I think that's. I mean, look, he's allowed to have his opinion, but I'm also allowed to have mine. I think that's very clearly not true. Derek Chauvin is facing probably the rest of his life or close to it in prison. So we are, and the 3 other officers with him are charged with accessory to murder. So we do, in fact, sort out the good cops from the bad cops. That is happening right now. So why is that statement supposed to be left by the rest of us, not just unchallenged, but revered? We are to accept it. And also the claim that we're going to stop everybody from being afraid of the police. Look at the polling. Just go around and ask somebody, are you afraid in America? Are you walking around afraid of cops every day? That would be, for 99% plus of Americans, an irrational fear, right? Unless you are engaged in criminal conduct, to be afraid of the cops day to day does not make sense. It's not reasonable. It's not rational. But are we ever, assume that that's true for a second, are people ever going to be able to be not afraid of cops? They're rioting and attacking police in the UK. They're rioting and marching in Amsterdam. So, I mean, which have very different police-civilian relationships and procedures than we do. And so what do we really think is an acceptable end goal here? My friends, ultimately, it's a mobilization for left-wing power. And I will get to how defund the police very quickly transitions into enlarging the state and enlarging the sectors of socialism that we already have in this country. But first, there's some interesting backstory that's come to light since we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about the George Floyd case involving the officer former officer now, and accused murderer who was kneeling on his neck. I'll get to that.
What kind of history?
They bumped heads.
How?
It has a lot to do with Derek being extremely aggressive within the club with some of the patrons, which was an issue.
Is there any doubt in your mind that Derek Chauvin knew George Floyd?
No, he knew him.
How well?
We interfaced with officers.
How well did he know him?
I would say pretty well.
I thought this was really interesting. This was a CBS News report from a coworker at a Minneapolis club where Derek Chauvin and George Floyd had both been involved in working security. And the claim here is that they didn't like each other, that they had problems in the past, that they definitely, I mean, so if this is, assuming this report is accurate and it comes from CBS News, what you have here are two individuals who may have had, outstanding, animosity toward each other. And then Officer Chauvin may have taken the opportunity, in a sense, to use his law enforcement power to settle a personal score. Now, that doesn't change that it's murder. It doesn't change that it's horrible what he did to this individual. It doesn't change that at all. But it is noteworthy because we're talking about this as if it's the initial narrative is that this was just a white cop interacting with a black civilian, and that this just happens and that it happens far too frequently. And this was the storyline the first day. Well, it still looks like murder, and Officer Chauvin, the charges wouldn't change here. In fact, you might even argue that they could escalate, that the escalated charge is on even firmer ground, considering that he might have seen George Floyd trying to pass the alleged crime here is passing, I think, a fake $20 bill, and the store called the cops. And Chauvin might have been like, I really don't like this guy, and I'm really going to show him, and he killed him. That's a big, no matter what you think about any of the, the protest movement, everything else, just stay with me here on the case for a moment. That's a big addition to all of this and our thinking about all of this and what might have been Chauvin's real motivations. Because if this wasn't just a cop who saw a black man and had this racist impulse to use excessive force against him, and that's really the initial story that we've all read and been told. If this is a guy who, by the way, might still be racist, I'm not saying he's not, but if this is a guy who had a personal animosity against this individual, and perhaps that wraps in with his racism or his feelings about interactions as a cop with African Americans, but it's noteworthy. It's noteworthy that here you have an individual who maybe really disliked George Floyd, and then when he had his power as a cop, he decided he was going to abuse it. But that's different from the system being, that's different from the system being the issue here. That's even more clearly an individual, perhaps acting on racist impulses, but an individual who saw this and it essentially set him, it set him off in a way where he decided that he was going to use the opportunity to, and again, this might be going even further than this report, but to settle a score or to just basically get at this guy that he didn't like on a personal level. That is a shift from just cop meets random person that he's interacting with who is black and acts on this racist impulse, which is, I think it's fair to say, the way the story has been presented at this point, this seems more like, based on this story, cop who had a pre-existing problem with this particular guy and then engaged in the excessive force and the alleged murder here that has created all this protest and national conversation. So just updating the story, and as we have more on this, I'll bring it to your attention. But I did think that this was very interesting, that they definitely, according to this witness who would know, they definitely knew each other and they definitely didn't like each other.
I came outside, I sat down with the protest, and they called me up and asked me if I was willing right there to commit to getting rid of the police. And I was honest. If we're talking about massive cultural shift in the way our police department does business, I'm on board. If we're talking about major structural reform that pushes back on the horrid nature of how our police departments have treated black and brown communities, I am fully on board. But if we're talking about abolishing the entire police department, I was honest. That's not where I am.
So concepts, that was the Minneapolis mayor there, who has taken a break from crying profusely at the casket of George Floyd. I'm sorry. That kind of performative, emotional theatrics from a politician, just like Pelosi and all the rest of them taking a knee with the traditional African print scarves around their necks. This just the stuff that you're seeing going on. It's just all so obvious, and I think, under normal circumstances, if people were a little bit less crazed than they are right now, everyone would recognize this as somewhat cynical and really exploitative for these politicians to be doing this stuff. But at least the Minneapolis mayor is like, okay, we're not really like, let me talk to you about how much I love social justice, and we're going to do all these things. It's going to be great. But we're not really going to defund the cops, right? Come on. That's not really going to happen, is it? Well, here's what this will turn into. And it is a Mott and Bailey argument, right? The Mott and Bailey is a reference to the medieval fortified position. It's kind of like a castle, but it's not really necessarily a castle. It's usually the Mott was a raised area with a fence around it, a protective fence, and it could be where some of the villagers live and so forth. And then the Bailey was the elevated, even higher area that was the retreat. It was almost like the keep in a castle formation. And a Mott and Bailey argument is, you say, okay, I want you to, if you're in high school, make this really easy, and you're in the student council, you say, I want you to get rid of all homework, and also we want to be able to not wear ties on Friday. And you go, okay, well, no, you're not going to get rid of all homework, but okay, we'll get rid of ties on Friday. You go, so that's reasonable, and you get what you want because that position, and by that is a reasonable position, right? But you could do something a little bit more extreme. Okay, well, we'll get rid of all homework, but also everybody gets at least a B. Well, we won't do the all homework thing, but I guess we can do everybody gets a B if you show up for class. So what we have with defund the police is just a version of that. It's not really defund the police. That's what we get everybody talking about. It's let's say that so we get all this attention and then we'll move back away from it. But really what it also opens up is an opportunity, a real window for expanding the state and for socialism. And you might say, oh, socialism, Buck. Oh, why is it always about socialism? Well, we already have sectors of socialism in America. In fact, the public school system itself is a sector. It's educational socialism. I mean, these things exist. We are not an entirely socialist state. We don't have the government controlling the means of production and the distribution of goods, but in some areas we do, and in some ways we do. And if you defund the police, here's how this plays out. If you have the more reasonable version of defund the police happening in cities across the country, and the activists, they get to shout the things that make them feel brave and virtuous and good. And then at the end of the day, they get to say, well, we helped Pelosi and Schumer and the Democrats move the football downfield. So clearly we're worthwhile and we're getting what we want here. But what defund the police turns into is, okay, there'll be a movement now. And you're already seeing this in New York where it's happening. There'll be a movement away from funding the police at the current level. And they'll take that money and they'll give it to social justice causes. They'll give it to community organizers. And then there'll be an expectation that funding will continue because, oh, my gosh, you can't cut, after school programs and you can't cut, social workers and social services and these kinds of things. But then when the crime rises, you know what ends up happening? Then a reasonable response to that will be, hey, we need more money for cops. Things have gotten a little out of control here. And so then it's just raise taxes and spend more of the public money on this. And you have, yet again, more redistribution of wealth going through the system because you're going to end up getting back to funding. It might take a while, and there'll be a lot of people who will get raped and murdered and assaulted and robbed. And, there's that cost that will be forgotten about by the left as quickly as it happens. But beyond that, everyone will realize that the reasonable position will be we need more law enforcement to get back to what used to be the very low numbers of crime, relatively speaking, that we had before we started doing this. How do you do that? That's right. Raise taxes. More money comes out of the economy and goes to this. And no one's really going to be looking at the social programs that have had the increase in funding. No one's really going to say, oh, well, now we're going to get rid of all these different early interventions, all these things that major cities keep doing and that do nothing that they can point to as actually working. Right? And how do you even know? How can you even really tell? But that's how I think this becomes. It really becomes a win-win for the left. Even if they reduce funding for police departments and divert those funds, they get to claim victory. They get to put money in the hands of community organizers that are going to help turn out the vote for Democrats. Look at what happens with the public school system. The public school system, which is a sector of socialism, is run for the benefit not of the children that are in it, but for the adults who are paid by it. And what they will keep saying, and there was some tweet about how we talk about defunding the police, but we've been defunding education for decades. I mean, it's just not true. I mean, education funding if you look at a graph of it, it keeps going up and up and up and up. We're spending more money on education all the time, and we're not getting better outcomes. Outcomes are not improving. Test results, not improving. But more money. You need more money. Gotta have more money. And so then we go to, okay, where does that money come from? And it's going to be taxing the productive class, people who work, taking more of their earnings. And it'll also be for homeowners, people that, depending on where you are, this is how they get funding for the school system. As you know, for most of you, it's through your property taxes is how they're funding the school system. And they're going to raise property taxes and put more money into the school system, right? So they have a bad school system that spends too much money, then turns around and says, well, we're failing, so we need more of your money. And then they put more of that money in the school system, and the cycle continues. And the people that are getting the money mobilize to make sure that the people that are in charge keep that system going. This is how the Democrat power system. This is why teachers' unions are so important in the Democratic Party, and why when they start talking about public sector unions, they get very uneasy because they don't want anyone to pay attention to. Only the cops union has to get attention, right? Not teachers' unions. And they also don't want to talk about budget cuts. They never want to cut budgets. They always want to take money from people and give it to other people. That is the redistribution of wealth that is central to the Democrats' plans here. So Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis, here saying he won't abolish police departments. Well, he knows that they just got to keep the police department somewhat in place. They can move a whole lot of funding to other causes and then take a bow for it. Say, look at how great we are. And if things start to go badly, they'll just say, well, we're going to raise the property taxes and put more, or we'll demand federal money. In a lot of cities right now, this is a debate that we know has been going on for weeks. They're going to say, oh, it's because of COVID-19 that we can't pay our bills as a city, so give us more money. And what's that? That's just money. I was going to say it's coming from taxpayers. It's really coming from your children and your children's children by adding to the national debt, which is putting downward pressure on their quality of life, their wealth, their ability to earn the same kind of living that you have. So this is how the system actually plays out. People I know don't want to hear this. They want to think that there's some way to make all of this so much better. Producer Mark, where is that AOC clip that I sent you where when she's asked about this, she just goes off and starts babbling? Is that clip 2? No, that's not clip 2. That must be clip 3, right?
I believe so.
Let's play clip 3.
Why is it necessary to take the money from the police? I mean, I understand your argument, the argument you're making about expanding social services, investing in social services, but the research does show that more police on the street means less crime.
Well, I think there's one question that is interesting here is that when it comes to funds, it's not always just about the number of officers in the street. It's about these police precincts that have tanks, that have military weaponry, and frankly have a degree of material resources and warlike weaponry that people ask, why does a local police precinct have this in the first place? And the other question here too is, I think it's a valid question for people to ask, what should be our number one budget priority at all? Does any agency deserve to be funded more than almost all the others for healthcare, housing, and youth combined?
Oh, okay. So now we can talk about too much spending on a government agency when it's convenient for the libs. And notice how she completely evaded. I mean, Stephanopoulos here asks her a very straightforward question that all the research, and this is true, more cops, less crime. Very straightforward. So how is it going to help in these communities to pull back on funding when criminality is still a major issue in cities, in a lot of cities across the country? Not so much in all cities, but a lot of them. And she just jumps into a whole other conversation about, but what about the tanks? And yeah, there's like guys that have like the scary like big guns and like the big like vroom vroom machines that like drive up with all the scary looking like tank stuff. And you're just like, well, what does this have to do with anything? We're asking, okay, you're talking about cutting funding for police. Are you only going to cut funding for that? That's military surplus. She doesn't even really know this. And a lot of this is just given from the military to cops to try to help keep them safe, whether they need it or not. Legitimate conversation. Some police forces do seem to be overly militarized, but A lot of that is actually just coming to them, either from federal grants or directly from military surplus. He has no idea about any of this stuff. But I would want to know, what about his question? How about we actually deal with this question? How does it help communities when policing, more police means less crime? Why does cutting back on their budget make things better for that community? I just don't have like an answer. It reminds me a little bit of, when you were in like poli-sci class back in the day, those of you that studied that, or whatever, any 101 intro level class. And in some professors like to do this thing where they'll just ask a question, you sir, or you madam, they'll ask a question. And there was always that student, usually there were a few of them in the class, who, when they get called on, tell me from what we read last night about, Smith v. Smitherson, what do you think the final dispensation of that case should have been? And the person goes, well, yeah, like I totally read the Smith case and feel like, it was really in depth and articulated like a lot of the issues that, and you're all sitting there kind of slapping yourself in the face going, oh my gosh, it's embarrassing. And that person actually thinks they're doing a good job as they do it. That's like AOC with a lot of things. That's pretty much what you get when you ask a real question. Just sort of spirals off into nonsense. Well, yeah, I just think that let's just talk about this thing that's so for real. And oh man, there you have it. Doesn't answer the question because they don't have an answer. It's not going to make people better off, particularly in minority communities that often in cities have higher levels of crime. Just stats, numbers. This is true. It's not going to help them to have fewer cops on the street. It's not going to make them safer. So why do that? Yeah, because there's tanks and the scary cop stuff that goes on. Not a good enough answer. But did Stephanopoulos jump in there? Did he interrupt her? Of course he doesn't interrupt her. Always remember this. The anchors interrupt to show the audience that they disagree and don't like this person. It's a very important little trick when you're watching at home. When the anchor interrupts somebody in a way that's aggressive and meant to derail them, it's their way of still being a journalist, but showing the audience that they don't like the person. Happened to me at CNN. I used to joke around. I'd go on Twitter, watch. They'll ask me, the anchor will ask me an unfair question, will interrupt me as I'm trying to answer it within 15 seconds. And then the other person, the Democrat, they're both Democrats, of course, but the other person will start trying to talk, and the anchor will shift and let that person go uninterrupted. And if I try to jump in, they'll say, no, Buck, the other person's talking now. And then maybe they'll just cut to commercial. And then, you had your segment, you're done. That's the classic, the CNN ambush, I used to call it. They did it all the time. He didn't do that to AOC. That's for darn sure. Oh, we got an update for you on the General Flynn case. Oh, my. This should be the thing formerly known as the General Flynn case because it should be over, but it's not. Even with all the information we have now, even with all the clarity on the ambush, on the politicized hunt for Flynn that was underway by the FBI and the DOJ, by the Obama appointees therein, and also senior members of those institutions who are bureaucrat deep staters. Now we have this bizarre situation where Judge Sullivan has asked for another former judge to come in to file an amicus brief. This judge, John Gleeson. And Gleeson says the DOJ Flynn dismissal is pretextual and a gross abuse of prosecutorial power, which, of course, is what Judge Sullivan wanted here. And then he says, Gleeson recommends that Sullivan consider the reversal of the plea. And this is from a Mr. Technofog on Twitter, who does very good legal stuff. Gleeson recommends that Sullivan consider the reversal of the plea be considered in fashioning the appropriate sentence for the false statement offense. As in, he should be punished even more for trying to take away his plea. Sullivan looks like he wants to go down with the ship here. Sullivan looks like he's going to just say, I don't care that the federal government dropped the case and says it should never have been brought. I'm going to sentence this guy anyway, forcing most likely a presidential pardon or waiting for a court of appeals to come along and overturn Sullivan, as will very likely happen. Although all you need is enough Obama judges in the D.C. circuit, and Obama appointee judges might just decide, nope, they're gonna let this stand. It might go all the way to the Supreme Court. Who knows? This is an appalling abuse of justice, and it shows that if you're a conservative, if you're on the right, you cannot trust in political cases of any kind. You cannot trust our justice system. You cannot even trust our judges. This is grotesque. It's wrong, but I'm glad that people are seeing this.